There's a small town hidden deep in the mountains, one that people rarely visit. Not because it's hard to find, but because of the stories. The locals warn travelers to stay away after dark, but they never say why. They're too afraid to speak of it. It all began with the old chapel at the edge of the forest. For decades, it stood abandoned, its windows shattered, the doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Rumors spread that something sinister lived there, but no one dared to go near it. Except for a group of curious teenagers one stormy October night. They had heard the whispers, the legends of the Silent Watcher. Supposedly, a creature with hollow eyes and twisted limbs haunted the chapel. It was said to appear only to those foolish enough to call its name 3 times inside the chapel walls. The kids didn't believe in such things, of course. They laughed at the stories as they made their way through the dense forest, the wind howling through the trees like a distant warning. When they reached the chapel, the air was unnaturally still. The door creaked open with a soft groan, and as they stepped inside, a heavy sense of dread fell over them. The once grand interior was decaying, pews covered in dust, old scriptures torn and scattered across the floor, and a single mirror hanging crookedly on the far wall. One of the boys, Danny, laughed nervously. "All right, who's going to say it first?" he joked. The others exchanged glances, their earlier bravado fading. After a moment of silence, Danny stepped forward, rolling his eyes at his friend's hesitation. He stood in front of the mirror, smirking, and said the name. "Silent Watcher, Silent Watcher, Silent Watcher." The moment the third name left his lips, the temperature dropped. The candle flames they had lit flickered wildly before going out completely. Panic gripped the group, but when they tried to leave, the door wouldn't budge. It felt like an invisible force was holding them inside. Suddenly, they heard a faint scraping sound from the far corner of the room. Slowly, a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was tall, its body grotesquely twisted, its eyes nothing but empty black voids. Its head moved jerkily, as though it hadn't used its muscles in years. And then it whispered, "Who called me?" The teenagers screamed, clawing at the door, desperate to escape, but the creature was already upon them. The last thing they saw was their own terrified faces reflected in the mirror before everything went black. The next morning, the townspeople found the chapel door open. Inside were the bodies of the teens, their faces frozen in expressions of unspeakable horror. But the strangest thing? In the dust on the floor, there was a message, written in long, jagged letters. "One always stays." To this day, no one knows what happened to Danny. His body was never found. And if you ever visit that chapel and look into the mirror, you might just see a shadow standing behind you, a twisted figure, waiting, watching. But whatever you do, don't say his name. You wouldn't want him. The town never recovered from the tragedy, and the old chapel was officially condemned. But as time passed, curiosity got the better of some. Every few years, a traveler or brave local would dare to visit the site, often sneaking in under the cover of night. Most came back pale, shaken, and swearing they'd never return. Some didn't come back at all. 10 years after the incident, the story of the Silent Watcher had become something of a dare among the teenagers in neighboring towns. The legend had grown, with wild claims that the Watcher could possess people who lingered too long in the chapel, or that it followed those who disrespected its name. But no one had solid proof, just stories until Michael. Michael was different. He wasn't just a thrill-seeker looking for a spooky adventure. He was obsessed with the paranormal. Had heard about the Silent Watcher on an obscure online forum, where people shared stories of haunted places and mysterious disappearances. The moment he read the tale, he knew he had to see the chapel for himself. He was convinced that the creature was real, and more than that, he believed he could prove it. Armed with cameras, audio recorders, and a couple of friends had convinced to join him, Michael set out for the chapel one cold October night. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain, and the forest felt more oppressive than usual. Even his friends, who had been enthusiastic at first, were now hesitant. They felt a strange weight pressing down on them as they approached the decaying structure. When they reached the chapel, it was just as the stories described, eerily still, the wind around it completely silent. Michael didn't care. He was too excited, setting up his equipment as his friends exchanged uneasy glances. The plan was simple: document everything, and most importantly, capture footage of the Silent Watcher. If they were lucky, they might even get proof of what had happened to the teenagers a decade ago. Hours passed in uneasy quiet. The cameras whirred. The recorders picked up nothing but the occasional shuffle of feet. One of Michael's friends, Sarah, was on edge, her eyes constantly flicking toward the mirror at the back of the room. She swore she saw something moving in its reflection, but whenever she looked directly, there was nothing there. Finally, Michael made his move. He stood in front of the mirror, just like Danny had all those years ago. Silent Watcher, Silent Watcher, Silent Watcher. Nothing happened at first. The others let out the breaths they didn't realize they'd been holding. They exchanged nervous laughs, but Michael wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer to the mirror, his voice louder, more demanding this time. Silent Watcher, show yourself. The temperature plummeted. This time, they all felt its sudden cold, the weight in the air thick with malice. The candles flickered and went out. In the darkness, the mirror began to warp, its surface rippling like water. And then they saw it, a shadowy figure emerging from the glass, its eyes two hollow black pits. "Who called me?" Sarah screamed, stumbling back toward the door. Michael stood frozen, his camera still pointed at the creature. He whispered into the recorder, his voice trembling. "This is real, it's real." The creature moved closer, its twisted limbs creaking as it walked. But this time it didn't stop. It wasn't content with lurking in the shadows. It reached out, its bony fingers wrapping around Michael's arm. The cold that radiated from its touch was unbearable, like ice sinking into his bones. His friend screamed, pulling at the door, but it wouldn't open. Michael's breath hitched as the creature leaned in, its face inches from his. Its breath was rancid, a foul stench that made his stomach turn. "You should not have come." The next thing he knew, he was being pulled into the mirror. His reflection distorted, stretching and twisting, as if he was being sucked into some horrible other dimension. His screams echoed, muffled as his body disappeared into the glass. The last thing he saw was his friends, their faces frozen in terror, before everything went black. When the townspeople found the chapel the next day, all that remained were Michael's cameras and recording equipment, scattered on the floor. His friends were found outside, huddled together in shock, unable to speak. But Michael was gone, his body nowhere to be found. Once again, the mirror was the only clue. This time, there was a new message scratched into its surface: another stays. Now, the chapel sits even more ominously at the edge of the forest, its dark history growing longer. But the legend of the Silent Watcher lives on, a warning to all who dare to challenge it. The mirror is still there, and if you peer into it at the right moment, you might catch a glimpse of Michael forever trapped in the cold, hollow realm of the Watcher. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faintest whisper, "Don't call my name." But by then, it's too late.